Good morning. Today is Wednesday, May 13th. Welcome. And I want to do our objective. Our objective is that I will complete a guided reading worksheet to demonstrate my comprehension of the beginning of the Civil War, the first few battles. And I want to review from yesterday. Okay, if you haven't figured it out, we're now in the Civil War. And the first section that you read yesterday talks about the border states, the Confederacy, and the Union. The border states, as you remember, were the states that had slaves but did not leave the Union, such as Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky. And the Union did not want them to leave the Union because if they did, it would be harder to win against the South or the Confederacy. We know that Missouri was important because the Missouri was right on the Mississippi River, and we wanted to control the Mississippi River. The Union did, and keep the Confederacy from using it as their main transportation. And Maryland was really important that they not break away, because you all know Washington, D.C. sits on the Potomac River, and the Potomac River, Washington, D.C., is between Maryland and Virginia. It's not a state. It's its own little district, and it sits between Maryland and Virginia. So, if Maryland breaks away and becomes a Confederate state, and Virginia does, our capital is surrounded by the Confederacy. Not a great idea. That would have been bad for us. We also wanted to be able to attack from Washington, D.C. and Maryland, because Richmond became the Confederacy's capital, which is really weird because it's only about 100 miles from Washington, D.C. I don't know. I think if I were the Confederacy, I would probably made it down in Mississippi or Louisiana, some way far away, but they didn't. They made it 100 miles from the capital of the United States. Anyway, the border states were really important, and because Lincoln never said anything about freeing the slaves, the border states just stayed. Okay. Strengths and weaknesses. The North, their biggest strength was they had so many more people. They had millions and millions more people than the South. And that's helpful when you're talking about a long, drawn-out war, because you need more people to fight. Their other strength was they were industrialized. That's where almost everything was manufactured in the United States. Another thing they don't talk about in here, but it was really important, was that, remember, about 2/3 of the railroads and roads and all transportation was in the North. So it was easier for them to get supplies made and then shipped to wherever they needed them. The South, on the other hand, only had about 1/3 of the railroads, and they used the waterways, especially the tributaries that go into Mississippi River and the Mississippi River. Well, as you learned today, we will take over the Mississippi River and we'll cut them off, which makes it really hard for them. So, the strength for the Confederacy was, number one, they had many more military leaders, because I told you yesterday in our preview that in the South it was almost all agriculture, and so normally the first son would inherit most of the farm, and they would get, there's only so much property, and that's everything was agriculture, which meant property. So if you were rich and you had a plantation, you took the first child, male child, and you usually taught them, how to run the plantation. And the other ones helped too, but the first one was probably going to run it. So then you took the other ones and you had one go and learn how to be a lawyer and a doctor. And the other one that was really big was we sent our kids to military school. If you were in the South in a plantation, they had lots of kids. So they would send the later boys, male children, to military school. And so they had a lot more military leaders that actually knew what they were doing. The other big strength for them was that they had a cause. The North, the Union, as we call them, or the Yankees, were fighting for, let's keep our country together. That's very philosophical. It's, hey, that's a good thing. But in the South, they were fighting for what they considered freedom. Remember, that was one of the reasons we won the American Revolution, was we were fighting for a cause. The other reason that America won was because we were using home field advantage, because we were fighting on our territory. And the same thing happens for the South. Almost all of the battles were in the South, and so the Southerners knew their own land. They knew what they could use against the Union Army, and that helped them. Okay. They didn't prevail, which is why we're still the United States of America with all the states, but they definitely had helped them. Okay, the goals of the war from yesterday. The goal of the South was to break away. They wanted their own country. And remember, they said, as states' rights, they chose to join the Union, they could choose to leave. The goal of the United States of America, or the Union, was to keep the Union together with all of the states. So the South, it was a defensive war. They just put their armies in front, and the Union had to come down, fight them on their own land, and beat them. It had to beat them soundly, because the South was like, no, we don't want this, and we're going to fight to the end. So it was definitely a defensive war for the South and an offensive, attacking for the Union. Strategies for the South were, we're going to stay here, we're going to defend, and their idea was if they could get Great Britain and France to want to help them against the United States of America, they would have a much better chance of winning. That actually ended up not happening, and Lincoln figured out a way to keep them from helping. And that was, both Great Britain and France had freed all the slaves. They didn't have slavery anymore. So Lincoln ends up doing the Emancipation Proclamation. You'll read about that the next day, on Thursday or Friday, because by freeing the slaves, it did a lot of positive things, but it only freed the slaves in the South, on the states that had seceded from the Union. None of the border states, slaves were actually freed. But anyway, what that did is it kept the Great Britain from France from helping them. The Union strategy was, hey, we're going to do a blockade, which keeps goods from coming from the ocean into the southern states. And we're going to take over the Mississippi River, which will keep them from shipping things up and down the Mississippi River. Because remember, what did the South do for a living? They did very little industry. So they couldn't produce their own ammunition. They weren't able to produce guns. They weren't industrialized. So what were they going to do? They were selling their cotton. They were going to sell it to European countries, and they would trade with them. Well, if we block them, we blockade from the oceans and the Gulf, and we block them from using the Mississippi River, we're going to strangle them. And General Winfield Scott was the one that came up with the Anaconda plan, which was, we're going to squeeze them until they hurt so bad they have to give up. Well, they didn't give up for a long time, though. It's a 4-year war. The other thing you should have read yesterday that was really important was that this was a battle, American versus American, brother against brother. And especially when it came to those border states, a family might be very divided. So a family in Missouri, some of the brothers might have gone and enlisted or got drafted to go into the Union Army. Some of them might have actually gone into the Confederacy's army. And this happened a lot. And they might even see each other on the battlefield. What a horrible existence to be fighting against your own relative, your own brother. And it was so bad that I find this quite interesting. Okay, so Mary Todd Lincoln, who's Abraham Lincoln's wife, her sister was married to a man who actually joined the Confederacy. He was an officer in the Confederate Army. So her sister didn't want to be in the South all by herself with her family. So Mary Todd's sister actually came with her children and lived in the White House while her brother-in-law, while the sister's husband was fighting for the Confederacy against the Union. Now talk about weird. That's weird, to let the enemy's family live in the White House. But it happened, and it is what it is. The average age of Civil War soldiers was mid-20s, but they definitely had under 18s. There were under 14-year-olds that were fighting. And towards the end in the South, there's a story about a military school in Virginia, where when the Union Army was marching up, the head schoolmaster said, boys, we're talking like 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old boys, get your weapons. And they went out and fought against the Union. It didn't last long. And the Union didn't want to kill the little boys, but when they're firing at you, you've got to do what you got to do. When the war began, both the North and the South thought this was going to be a really easy win. The North said, oh, we're going to go down there, we're going to attack, they're going to give up, and the war will be over really fast. The South said, oh, we're so good, and we have the right, and we're going to win this. We're going to go, and we're going to defend, and they're going to be like, this is too costly, and both people dying and money, and they'll just give up. Guess what? They were wrong. This was a bloody 4-year war that cost Americans 600,000 lives. That's more, or almost, at this point, it's actually a little different, but almost 600,000 is almost as many as all of the other wars put together for American lives. So this was a very long and bloody war. The North, of course, had many more people in the Army because they had so many more people that they could enlist. And then later, we're going to end up drafting. Soldiers' life, they marched a lot. Life was pretty boring until it wasn't. And like with any war, the war part when you're actually battling is horrible. It's horrifying and a lot of death. But a lot of time you were sitting around doing nothing. So boring or horrible. They talk a little bit about the Battle of Shiloh, and you will learn more about it today. 23,000 casualties. The casualties mean death or injured. It was raining, and some of the men sat around for 24 hours in the rain, dying, because there was no one that could come and help them at that point. Just horrible, horrible conditions. Okay, so that was review from yesterday. Today, we have the next section, and you're only going to read half of this section. You're only reading pages 464 to 467 at the top. So you're going to start on the War of Land at Sea, and then your last one will be capturing New Orleans, and then in 467, War in the Eastern States will start for the next day. So you're only doing 464, 465, 466 in the first paragraph, and 467. Okay, so preview for the day. Okay, remember we talked about Fort Sumter and how it was the first battle, kind of? There were no casualties. No one died. No one got injured. The Confederate Army just went in. They fired some ammunition at the fort, and the fort just gave up because they couldn't win. They were surrounded by the enemy, literally, because they were in the harbor in South Carolina. Talk about being surrounded by the enemy. They couldn't win. So they gave up. Okay, so some people could say that was the first battle, but it definitely wasn't the first major battle. That's where we're going to start today. The first major battle of the Civil War happened, and I know it's going to shock you, but in Virginia. Okay, remember I told you that Maryland's right above Washington, D.C., and Virginia is across the Potomac. Literally, you could hit a ball over the Potomac and be in Virginia from the Washington, D.C., which is our capital. So it doesn't surprise anyone that on July 21st of 1861, the Union took their troops and they marched across the Potomac over the bridge, and that's when they came into contact with the Confederate Army. And basically the way it worked is two armies would march, and then when they would hit each other, they would then have a battle. Okay, so it makes sense that the first one would be right outside of Washington, D.C. So the town's name, the city's name was called Manassas, Virginia. It's known, depending on which side you talk to, it's sometimes known as the Battle of Manassas, First Battle of Manassas actually, or the First Battle of Bull Run. Bull Run is the creek that ran through the area. So sometimes they call it by the closest physical feature, sometimes it's by the closest city. So you might hear it Battle of Manassas or Battle of Bull Run. Most of the time it's the First Battle of Bull Run. So The Union Army had been practicing and drilling and getting ready to go to war in Washington, D.C. And so when they started to march over the bridge, a lot of people from Washington, D.C., hundreds of them, said, "Oh my God, they're getting ready to have a battle. Let's go have fun." Remember, we've talked about this a lot, that there was no internet, there was no TV, there was no Nintendo or any other gaming system. So what did they do for fun? Well, let's see. One thing they did is they went to public executions, right? They would go to things that would amuse them. So the DC people got in their wagons, they brought their children and their dogs and a picnic lunch. And they went out and set up where they thought, or approximately where they thought, that this first battle was going to be. And they were picnicking and throwing balls around and having a good time until the actual battle happened. When the battle took place, at first the Union was pushing back the Confederacy. But Stonewall Jackson, as he became known, said, "No, hold your position." And then they started attacking the Union. And neither side was really ready for this. This is the first battle. Many of them had never been in a battle. So when the Confederacy took action and started attacking the Union got scared and they started retreating. And when I mean retreating, they were running away. So they start running back towards Washington, D.C. Well, remember all those people I told you, hundreds of them that came and hung out and were having a picnic and having a good old time to watch the battle? They were in the way. So the Union Army was running over them, knocking over things. Some of them, the civilians got hurt. People died. Some of the Union Army, some of the Confederacy actually died. And then the Union Army went back over the Potomac, and that was the end of the battle. So it was the first win for the Confederacy. After this first battle, both sides said, uh-oh, especially Lincoln, when his Union Army got beat and they came running back across. He said, this is going to be a long war. And both sides knew it at that point. And Stonewall Jackson gets his name that way. That's why they call him Stonewall. Okay, so the next thing you're going to read about is the West. The Union wants to get a hold of the West because they want to control the Mississippi River. If they can keep the Confederacy from using the river, then they're going to control their money. And if you don't have money, you can't go to war. And you can't continue fighting a war if you don't have money, because then you're not going to have supplies, you're not going to have food, you're not going to have medicine, you're not going to have ammunition. So they wanted to control the Mississippi River. Okay, so ultimately, the Union does take over the Mississippi River. Okay, the next section you're going to read about is the Battle of the Ironclads. Ironclads were wooden ships, wooden boats. And the wooden boats, so the South, the Confederacy, had a boat. There was a boat. It was actually a northern boat at one point. They take it over and they put metal on it, a metal shield over it. And when they started attacking Union ships, well, when the Union ships would take their cannonballs, remember, these weren't bombs. They weren't, anything that exploded. They were a heavy metal ball. So the cannon would shoot it, it would hit off, and it would roll into the water, which gave the Confederacy with their ironclad, which they called, it was the Merrimack, and they renamed it the Virginia. It gave the Virginia an advantage, and then they could shoot their cannonballs and then get the other boat and the other ship and sink it. So after watching this for a while, the United States, the Union said, "Oh, we should probably get one too." And so they put metal on a ship called the Monitor. And eventually the Monitor and the Merrimack on March 8th, 1862 meet. And they start cannonballing each other. Well, guess what? The cannonball hit the metal and rolled into the water. So guess what? Neither side won. There was no winner in that one. They eventually both just went the other way. Let's see. The next section is the Battle of Shiloh. Okay, Shiloh is a church. It was a church outside of Corinth, Mississippi. And General Grant and his 40,000 troops headed towards that area. Are called, then they camped at Pittsburgh Landing. This is in Mississippi. And they got some additional troops from Nashville. The Confederate leaders decide, wow, they're really building up a force here. We better do something. So Johnson and Beauregard, who were the generals for the Confederacy, they decided to do a surprise attack. The battle lasted for 2 full days. It was a narrow victory for the Union, but there were 23,000 casualties between the two sides. 23,000 either dead or wounded. And then after the Battle of Shiloh, the Union troops laid siege to Corinth, which is, they just bombed, forcing the Confederates to withdraw. And that way, they were definitely on their way to controlling the Mississippi River. The next thing that the Union decided they wanted to do was they wanted to capture New Orleans. New Orleans is on the mouth of the Mississippi River. If you control New Orleans, nothing can go up or down the Mississippi River. And this would be the final straw to stopping the Confederacy from getting products in and out. Okay, so a few weeks after Shiloh, on April 25th, 1862, the naval forces under Admiral David Farragut. You might know Admiral Farragut. You've probably heard of him. There's a school over in St. Pete. Anyway, so he actually captures New Orleans. And that was a really big blow to the Confederacy because now we stopped them from using the Mississippi River. That's all you have to do. Fill in the guided reading. It is a Word document, or I put it as a PDF. You can, if you want to download it onto your device, you can fill in the answers right into the Word document, save it, and then send it back to me that way. Or you can you don't have to write all of the stuff out. Just write the answers where the blanks are, but number 1, and then fill in your answer. That's it. There's no reason to write it all out if you're not going to be able to download it. That's fine. But make it easy on yourself. Just write the answer with the right number, and you'll be done. It shouldn't take you that long. Okay, I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day.